Good morning. The events in the United States over recent weeks have been really, really sad. And I'm not talking about the actions of some politicians or even the state of the coronavirus. I'm talking about the death of a black man by a police officer who knelt on his neck, despite the man pleading, saying, "I cannot breathe," and bystanders peacefully insisting that the police officer relent. The death of George Floyd has set off a string of protests in America, and perhaps more than ever, led to an outcry that Black Lives Matter. This organization itself has garnered more support and donations in recent weeks than ever before. A number of insightful pieces of journalism over recent days have highlighted many of the difficult issues surrounding systemic racism in the United States. They discuss everything from racial profiling to incarceration rates, to highlighting the lack of opportunities in employment and education. Racism can be a difficult thing to talk about, but it is important that we do talk about it. It is particularly important that young people talk about it. We all need to learn from the past, and indeed the present, so that we can make the future better. I grew up outside of Detroit, a city known for race problems over the past decades, particularly riots in 1968. I regularly worked in downtown Detroit and grew up surrounded by some of the richness of African American culture. Detroit is famous for Motown music, and I've always loved the music of my hometown and other forms of music inspired by African Americans, including jazz. Now, some of my close friends know that I have a secret love of rap music. That's not something headmasters are supposed to admit, I suppose, but I have found listening to Tupac in the past week to feel rather apt. My birthday is the 15th of January, which is a birth date I share with Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And in the course of my childhood, President Reagan signed a law that made my birthday, or rather Dr. King's birthday, a national bank holiday in America. It's a pretty significant moment in your childhood when your birthday suddenly becomes a national bank holiday. And partly for this reason, I've always had an obsession with Dr. King, writing many school reports about him, and I still regularly return to his speeches and lessons about nonviolence and passive resistance. I remember watching President Barack Obama win the US election in November 2007. I was living in a boarding school at the time, and I did not have my own television, so I sat in the common room of one of the boys' boarding houses in the middle of the night and listened to Obama's acceptance speech. I remember thinking in that moment, as a black man was becoming president of the United States, perhaps that was a signal of the end of systematic racism over centuries in America, that started with slavery and then segregation and continued less formally for decades. Perhaps this was the day Dr. King marched for. With the election of Barack Obama, some people even went so far as to say it was the day that the legacy of slavery in America was finally abolished. As we learned during Obama's presidency, and we've been reminded in the past couple of weeks, it's not quite that straightforward. Racism is still a problem in America. There are gaps in education, in employment, and in other opportunities, and problems in the criminal justice system. Personally, I feel really comfortable in diverse settings. And when I'm at home in the holidays visiting my parents in Detroit, I don't mind going to speakeasies or jazz bars where I'm the only white person in the room. My mother actually sings in a large gospel choir near our home, and she's regularly the only white person on the stage. But not everyone is so comfortable with diversity like that, and racism is a problem. And it's not just a problem in the United States, it's a problem across Europe. And there have been many conversations about racism in professional football, even in the course of the past season. And in a way, the events of recent weeks just make me sad. It makes me sad that the country where I grew up is a place where African American children and adults do not have the same opportunities as other Americans to access that American dream. And more than this, many African Americans live in fear of being killed in what for most people might be a routine interaction with the police. Now, I do think amongst all this noise, it's important to be careful about what we say about the police, because I know that the vast majority of police across the Western world do an admirable job, and they are public servants who deserve our respect and praise. I actually have an extended family member who works in law enforcement in America, and he's been particularly disturbed by how all police can be treated unfairly as perpetrators in times like this. As he wrote to me last week, one bad apple does not ruin the whole lot. Having acknowledged all of this, it's clear that the death of George Floyd was unnecessary, and there are too many other similar examples. I've also been disturbed by the nature of some of the protests. The violence and the looting is not helpful and detracts from the purpose of the wider protests and the more important messages about injustice. I was most touched by the sheriff of Flint, Michigan, a city in my home state, where that sheriff took off his riot gear, literally laying down his helmet and baton, and instead walked with the protesters along the streets. He recognized that people wanted to be heard, and he understood the anger. There have been many other touching scenes where police in uniform took a knee in symbolic support of the protesters, or shook hands with them and listened to their concerns. Many local and national politicians in the United States have done the same. Safe protest is important. It's part of the US Constitution, and it's part of Western democracy. It's a vital form of free speech. People should be able to stand up for what they believe in and argue for change and challenge the government. And when this is not permitted, as we see most strikingly in China and Hong Kong at the moment, it becomes obvious just how important protests can be. Now, there have been protests in America before about race, but hopefully this time we have reached something of a tipping point. As we saw in recent years with the hashtag #MeToo movement, when so many women spoke out, and there was a real sense that what happened in the past was not okay, and perpetrators were going to be held to account, and such injustice will not be tolerated now or in the future. Similarly with race, I hope that what started in Minnesota and the people who have stood up or taken to the streets or taken a knee across the United States and now across Europe does lead to some meaningful change. It's an opportunity for us all to recommit to eradicating racism. But more than protesting, I hope that some of these young people involved will vote as well. Voting is another powerful aspect of our democracy and an essential part of ensuring that there is change. So to the young people listening today, do remember that, because young people are not always known for voting. To those young people, I'm sorry that my generation hasn't solved these issues and that racism is still such a major issue in society. Clearly, I have more work to do, as do other people in leadership positions like me, as do all of us who can vote, to ensure that everyone in society has equal opportunity, regardless of their age, color, physical or mental disability, race, religion, creed, sex, marital status, or sexual orientation. And despite all the upsetting aspects of news in recent weeks, working with young people every day is fulfilling in many ways, and it does give me hope for the future. I sincerely hope that your generation will do better and avoid racism and sexism and discrimination of any kind. As Reverend Al Sharpton said at George Floyd's memorial service last week, this time is different. White people have outnumbered black people marching in the streets in America. And the marches are not just in cities in the South, but they're in Berlin, they're in London, they're across Europe and North America. It's a different season and a different time. So to the young people watching this video and listening today, I challenge you to learn more about the history of racism. Understand the legacy of slavery in Europe and the United States, and about segregation in America. Learn more so that you can understand the context in which the asphyxiation of George Floyd is another sad chapter in the story of African American history. But I hope this can also be a transition point, and I share Rev Sharpton's optimism that this time is different. I'm confident that your generation will do better. And I'm still hopeful that in my lifetime, I will see Dr. King's dream come true, where we might live in nations where people are not judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Take care of yourselves and take care of each other.